For 13 straight nights, American warplanes lit up the Iranian sky. Then, without warning, the strike stopped. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. In a war that had settled into a grim, predictable rhythm of nightly bombing, that silence was stranger than the bombs themselves. Was it the first real sign that a ceasefire might hold, or was it the quiet before something far bigger? Inside the White House, inside the Pentagon, and inside Tehran, officials were asking the same question the rest of the world could only guess at. What comes next may determine whether the Middle East steps back from the edge of a wider war or plunges further into one. To understand why 3 days of silence could feel this significant, you have to go back more than a year to a 12-day war in June of 2025, when Israel launched a surprise assault on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, killing senior military commanders and nuclear scientists, and striking an underground enrichment site. The United States joined that campaign with strikes of its own on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran responded by firing missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a major American installation, though the attack caused no casualties. That round of fighting ended in a ceasefire, but it did not end the underlying conflict. It only paused it. The core dispute over Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, and its influence across the region remained unresolved, and both sides knew it. That unresolved tension detonated again on February 28, 2026. In a coordinated operation, Israeli and American forces struck targets across Iran, and according to Iranian state media, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed at the age of 86. He had led Iran since 1989. President Trump confirmed the death publicly, describing Khamenei as one of the most evil people in history, and said the bombing campaign would continue for as long as necessary to achieve what he called peace throughout the Middle East. Israeli officials said the strikes also killed the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and the country's defense minister. Iran retaliated with missile and drone attacks against Israel and against American forces and allies across the Gulf, and it moved to restrict the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes. The closure sent shockwaves through global energy markets and disrupted fuel supplies as far away as Asia. The death of a supreme leader who had held power for nearly 4 decades raised a question nobody could answer with confidence. What happens to a theocratic government when the man at the center of its entire structure is suddenly gone? Analysts who study Iran's political system were divided. Some argued the killing could fracture the regime's chain of command and accelerate its collapse. Others cautioned that Iran's system was built with succession mechanisms designed to survive exactly this kind of shock, and that removing one man, however powerful, does not automatically topple a government that controls a large military, an intelligence apparatus, and a network of allied militias across the region. More than a year into this new phase of the war, that question remains genuinely unsettled, and it sits underneath everything that has happened since. There's also the matter of intent. Trump framed the February campaign not simply as retaliation or deterrence, but as an attempt to give the Iranian people what he called their greatest chance to take back their country, language that suggested regime change rather than a narrower goal of degrading weapons programs. That distinction matters enormously for how this story is likely to end. A war aimed at destroying a nuclear program can, in theory, conclude with a technical agreement, inspections, and verification measures both sides can point to as proof of success. A war aimed at toppling a government has no equivalent off-ramp, because there is no document Iran's leadership can sign that satisfies a goal of its own removal. Whether Washington's actual objective sits closer to the first outcome or the second has never been fully clarified in public statements, and that ambiguity has shaped how both allies and adversaries have responded to every ceasefire offer since. Months on from Khamenei's death, Iran's government had not collapsed. It had not offered the unconditional surrender Trump had demanded in a social media post back in early March. Instead, the state pressed forward with the same tools it had always relied on to project strength abroad while managing unrest at home: its missile arsenal, its network of allied militias, and its control over one of the most economically consequential waterways on Earth. That resilience, whether born of genuine institutional strength or simply the absence of a coordinated alternative within Iran itself, became the backdrop against which every subsequent round of negotiation would play out. After more than 5 weeks of fighting following the February strikes, the United States and Iran reached a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th, mediated by Pakistan. It was a fragile arrangement from the start. Hours after it was announced, Israeli forces conducted a wide-ranging bombardment of Lebanon, killing hundreds of people, and it remained disputed among the parties whether Lebanon had even been covered by the agreement in the first place. The ceasefire held on the Iran front, but the underlying dispute over the Strait of Hormuz never went away. Instead, it turned into a slow-motion standoff with the United States and Iran, each testing how far the other would let them push. That standoff produced a formal attempt at resolution. On June 17th, after 2 months of difficult negotiations, the United States and Iran signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding intended to convert the temporary ceasefire into something more lasting within 60 days. Diplomats involved in the talks described it at the time as the first real structural framework for ending the conflict, rather than simply pausing it. But the agreement contained an ambiguity that would prove impossible to paper over. It required Iran to use its best efforts to allow safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait without charge for those 60 days, but it never explicitly ruled out Iran imposing fees or asserting some degree of control over shipping traffic afterward. Iran interpreted that silence as license to maintain long-term leverage over the waterway, effectively reading the temporary provision as an admission that its authority there was, at minimum, negotiable rather than settled. Just over a week after the memorandum was signed, Iran launched a drone strike against a ship passing through the strait, the first sign that the interim peace was already cracking under the weight of a single, unresolved sentence of legal language. That single ambiguity is worth pausing on, because it illustrates something larger about this entire conflict. Wars like this one are rarely reignited by a single dramatic betrayal. More often, they are reignited by the kind of vague, diplomatically convenient wording that lets two sides sign the same document while believing it means two different things. The Strait of Hormuz clause was written to get both delegations to a signing ceremony. It was never actually written to survive first contact with a real cargo ship. By early July, the pattern had turned into something far more dangerous. Iran attacked 3 commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States responded with 2 rounds of strikes hitting more than 170 Iranian military targets, including air defense systems and vessels belonging to the Revolutionary Guard. Iran retaliated with drone and missile attacks against American forces and Gulf allies, wounding at least 1 person in Kuwait and triggering alerts in Bahrain and Qatar. Traffic through the strait ground to a near standstill. Iran's foreign ministry called the American strikes a gross war crime. And on the sidelines of a NATO summit, President Trump declared that the ceasefire deal was, in his words, over, using blunt and personal language to describe Iran's leadership. That same night, the United States intensified its campaign further, hitting 90 targets and widening its strikes into new regions of the country, including areas near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant. What followed was 13 consecutive nights of American airstrikes, the longest sustained bombing campaign of the entire conflict. Night after night, U.S. Central Command posted updates confirming it had struck military targets inside Iran. Iran answered with retaliatory strikes of its own, including drone attacks on American bases in Bahrain and Jordan. The economic shockwaves spread far beyond the battlefield. Oil prices, which had been trading near $72 a barrel at the start of July, surged more than 40% in 3 weeks, climbing past $100 a barrel as tensions around the strait intensified. That spike pushed the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note to its highest level in more than a year, a shift with implications for mortgage rates and borrowing costs for ordinary Americans who had nothing to do with the conflict itself. Stock markets fell sharply in a single session, with the Dow shedding more than 500 points and the Nasdaq dropping 2.5%. A war fought thousands of miles away was reaching directly into household budgets, retirement accounts, and the cost of a car loan in cities that had never appeared on a single wartime map. The reason a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman can move markets on the other side of the planet comes down to simple geography. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil, along with a substantial share of its liquefied natural gas, passes through the Strait of Hormuz, on its way from Gulf producers to refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond. There is no easy detour. Alternative pipeline routes exist but cannot absorb anywhere near the volume that moves through the strait by tanker every day. That is precisely why Iran has repeatedly used the waterway as a pressure point rather than attacking oil infrastructure directly. Closing or even just threatening the strait forces the rest of the world to feel the cost of the war immediately, through the price at the pump, long before most people have read a single headline about missiles or airstrikes. At the height of this latest escalation, President Trump said he was close to deciding whether to launch what he called a massive attack, and described America's possible exit from the conflict as coming either through diplomacy or through continued military force. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi insisted publicly that Tehran was not seeking further mediation, blaming what he described as an irrational and hegemonic approach from Washington. Trump, for his part, said Iran was not ready to make a deal and accused its leadership of harboring what he called evil intentions. Both sides, in other words, were publicly signaling that the war might still be far from over, even as maritime tensions kept climbing. American forces disabled a tanker in the Gulf of Oman after its crew tried multiple times to breach the U.S. naval blockade of Iran. And in the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia struck Houthi targets in Yemen after the Iran-backed group attacked another Saudi vessel, a sign the conflict was pulling in actors well beyond the original combatants. Then, on July 25th, something changed. For the first time in 2 weeks, Central Command did not post an update announcing new strikes. It was not immediately clear whether that silence meant the United States had simply paused, or whether it reflected something happening behind closed doors. President Trump said that while Washington was actively negotiating with Tehran, it remained entirely possible that the bombing campaign could continue or even escalate further. It was, in effect, an admission that the fighting could resume as easily as it had stopped. That same weekend, Trump confirmed that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would travel to Washington for a meeting at the White House, a visit that added another layer of uncertainty to an already unpredictable moment, since any American decision about Iran is now shaped in close coordination with an Israeli government that has its own calculations about how the war should end. By July 26th, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, was describing the pause in more deliberate terms. Appearing on American television, he said Trump was giving talks some space, and that negotiations were happening at every level, from technical discussions up to the highest levels of government. But in the same set of interviews, Waltz reiterated a warning that had defined the entire Trump approach to this conflict. The American military remained, in his words, locked and loaded, and the president was keeping all options on the table. It captured the strange duality of this moment precisely. Diplomacy was being given room to work, but the machinery of war had not been dismantled. It had simply been switched to standby. By July 27th, the pause had extended into a third consecutive night, and Trump said publicly that he had decided to hold off on further strikes, specifically to give negotiations another chance. Oil prices eased in response, a market signal that traders were, for the moment, betting on de-escalation rather than expansion of the war. Iran, according to reporting from the region, also appeared to halt its own retaliatory strikes during this window. For the first time in nearly a month, both sides seemed to be exercising restraint simultaneously rather than one side pausing while the other kept fighting. But a pause is not the same thing as an ending, and that distinction is exactly what makes this moment so difficult to read. Nothing about the underlying disputes that reignited this war in July has actually been resolved. The ambiguity over who controls passage through the Strait of Hormuz, the question of what remains of Iran's nuclear and missile capability after more than a year of strikes, and the leadership vacuum left by Khamenei's death are all still open. Trump has said repeatedly that America's path out of this conflict could run through either negotiation or renewed force, and he has never publicly foreclosed the second option. That is the dangerous question sitting underneath 3 days of quiet. Is this the beginning of an actual off-ramp, the kind of gradual, verifiable de-escalation that ends wars for good, or is it a tactical intermission, a chance for the United States and Israel to reposition assets, for Iran to regroup and rearm, and for both sides to recalibrate before another, possibly larger, round of strikes? Nobody outside the small circle of officials directly involved in these talks can answer that with certainty right now, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. What can be said, based on the pattern of the past 5 months, is that this conflict has repeatedly cycled through ceasefires, memorandums, and pauses that were each described at the time as steps toward a lasting peace, and each of which ultimately broke down over the same unresolved flashpoint: control of the Strait of Hormuz and the balance of military power in the Gulf. A ceasefire in April did not hold in the way many hoped. A memorandum in June did not survive contact with a single drone strike on a tanker. Whether this pause in July becomes the moment the pattern finally breaks, or simply the next entry in a now familiar cycle, is something only the coming days and weeks will reveal. Part of what makes this harder to predict than past conflicts is that the decision no longer rests with one government alone. Netanyahu's visit to Washington places Israeli calculations directly alongside American ones at exactly the moment a decision is being weighed. Israel and the United States have not always moved in lockstep on timing throughout this war, even when they have shared the same broad objectives, and any divergence between them now over how much more military pressure is worth applying, or how much risk a resumed bombing campaign would carry for a fragile ceasefire elsewhere in the region, could tip the outcome in either direction. On the other side, Iran's negotiating posture is being shaped by a leadership structure still adjusting to the loss of the man who had defined its politics for nearly 40 years, which makes it genuinely difficult for outside observers, and reportedly for American negotiators as well, to know whether the voices currently at the table can actually deliver on any commitment they make. There is also the question of what a durable resolution would even need to contain. Previous agreements addressed shipping access and short-term troop withdrawals, but neither the April ceasefire nor the June memorandum publicly resolved the deeper issue that triggered American and Israeli military action in the first place: the future of Iran's nuclear program and its long-range missile arsenal. Any lasting peace would likely require verification mechanisms substantial enough to convince both Washington and Jerusalem that Iran cannot reconstitute the capabilities that have already been struck twice in less than 14 months. Building that kind of verification regime, of the sort that took years to negotiate an earlier nuclear diplomacy with Iran, is a fundamentally different undertaking than agreeing to a temporary pause in strikes. And there is no public indication yet that talks have progressed anywhere close to that level of detail. What is clear is the scale of what is now at stake. This is no longer a contained, deniable shadow conflict fought through proxies and quiet strikes. It is an acknowledged war between a nuclear-armed superpower and a regional power whose supreme leader has been killed, whose military command structure has been repeatedly targeted, and whose economy and population are already absorbing enormous strain. It is a war that has already reshaped global oil markets, pushed up borrowing costs for American families, drawn in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait, and forced Israel's prime minister into direct, in-person coordination with the American president on what happens next. The stakes extend from a compound in Tehran to a gas station in Ohio, from a naval blockade in the Gulf of Oman to a mortgage rate in Sacramento. For now, the guns have gone quiet for 3 nights running, and both governments are describing that quiet as an opportunity rather than a retreat. But the same administration insisting it is giving diplomacy room to breathe has also made clear without hesitation that the military option remains locked, loaded, and ready to resume on short notice. That is the uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. In modern warfare, silence is no longer proof that peace has arrived. Sometimes it is simply the sound a war makes while it decides what it wants to become next.